What's up, y'all? Welcome to my channel. This is G, of course, and you all have to like, comment, and subscribe. Please remember to share the video. I'm going to be starting in just a moment here on a brief lecture, introduction to the Hebrew Roots movement. Who are they? What is a Hebrew Roots Christian? What do they believe? And then we've talked about the Law of Moses and its status in the New Covenant. I want to discuss that vis-a-vis the Hebrew Roots, what they believe, why I think they're in error, and then some of the key differences between what the law is teaching in the New Testament versus what the average lay Christian assumes is being taught, which again, most of them would be wrong, and then the Hebrew roots, which are also wrong. So it's kind of three. There's almost four different ways to go wrong with this. You have rabbinism, you have the Hebrew root style of the law, then you have complete antinomianism, and then you have the real way, the truth, TM, the truth. So people are now demanding that I do my lives 3 hours earlier to fit with their schedule. That ain't gonna happen. So it really just depends on the day. But like I said, we're gonna try to make these streams have kind of a longevity to them. I don't want it to just be me riffing and bopping with you guys in the live chat. So if you have important questions, ask an official question. Otherwise, I'm not going to highlight the comments. And if you'd like to come on and tell me I'm wrong or debate me or do whatever, you're free to do that. You will probably not succeed, but you're free to do it. So the Hebrew Roots movement. Let's open up one of these beautiful images here. Yeah. So a lot of the people who believe in Hebrew roots kind of market themselves as saying, we are reclaiming the Jewish roots of the New Testament, or really the Bible overall, but of the New Testament. And to that, I think there's nothing really wrong with that. But the thing is, that's a very vague statement. What are the Jewish aspects that we have forgotten that need to be brought back? Like, what is the point? Why do we need to do a Hebrew root? What's wrong with the other Christians, for example? Well, one of the things that the Hebrew roots do is they kind of paint all Christians as essentially the way that the reformers paint the Roman Catholic Church. So you're all Romans, you're all doing Romish paganism. You don't understand the complexity of the Hebraist movement, of the Hebraic view of Scripture. Now, again, you're going to notice that there are a lot of things that are kind of half-truths. So when a Hebrew roots person will say, most Christians don't understand the Hebraic nature of the Bible, in general, that's true, but that doesn't mean we have to join your movement. One thing that the Hebrew roots get wrong is that they don't understand the concept of covenants. So they don't understand what covenant they're in. Many of them refuse to acknowledge that they're even in a covenant. So the covenant system's gone, even though it's clear from Jeremiah chapter 31 and replete in the New Testament that we are in fact in the new covenant. And so any version of the law has to be fitted to that covenant. Why? Why? Well, here's the thing. Let's open up a little thing, chart here that I have, or I had. Let's see what we got. Yeah. There we go. We're going to open, we're going to share this tab instead. So if you take a look here at these various covenants, T. Sanders, thank you very much for the super chat, $10 US. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time, because time is money. So you are now giving me some of your time, your hard-earned time. Thank you for coming to the stream. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them per theology. But when we take a look at this, okay, I'm going to read out some of the covenants here. We have the Edenic covenant, so that's creation. The Adamic covenant begins in Genesis chapter 3. Most people just conflate them. They say, we have the covenant at the start. But I would say that's wrong, because the fall of Adam is a different agreement with God compared to the pre-fall human being, the Noahic covenant. So as you can see, almost the majority, exactly half of all the covenants, take place only in one book. That's the book of Genesis, Bereshit, in the Hebrew, if we're talking the Hebrew roots, okay? So the Edenic, the Adamic, the Noahic, the Abrahamic covenants are all in the book of Genesis. So that's why it's important to understand. We're going to do a whole thing on how to read the Bible as well. The chronology of Scripture, right? A lot of times, and I disagree with it saying the Palestinian covenant. I don't think that's how anybody would really say that, but it's a continuation of the Mosaic. And the Mosaic covenant continues through the kind of Holy Land covenant, the Davidic covenant, up until the New Covenant. But anyway, as you can see, a large amount of time passes in comparatively just a few pages. So if you look at the Bible, just the book of Genesis is a small percentage of the rest of the book, the rest of the books of the canon of the Bible. But the book of Genesis contains so much chronology. It contains the beginning creation. It contains the creation of man. It contains the first covenant. It contains the flooding of the world, the renewed promise between God and man through Noah. And then Genesis ends with the introduction to the patriarchs. Then we have another covenant, the Mosaic covenant. The most profound and well-known is the Mosaic or Sinai covenant. That's in Exodus. So far, all the covenants that we're looking at, including this one that's labeling the Palestinian covenant, all of them take place in the Torah so far. It's not until we get to the Davidic covenant, number 7 on this list, that we start to see a covenant actually exist outside of the Pentateuch. So all the covenants up until David take place in the Pentateuch. They're in the first 5 books of the Torah. So the first 5 books of the Torah have an emphasis on the reader and on what becomes the rest of Scripture. That's why when we do a stream just on how to read the Bible, you'll see that there is a concentric circle of what's considered important. When Christ says the law and the prophets, he means the Torah books and the prophetic writings. So he's referring to those as the most important. And other books are still important, but not as important as the law and the prophets. We'll see. But if we continue here, after this so-called Palestinian covenant, which really, again, is a continuation of Mosaic, we have the Davidic covenant, and that's a promise between God and David and his lineage, but that does not negate the Mosaic. So from 5 until 7, we're in the same idea of the law. So when St. Paul is talking about the law, he's talking about the 5 to 7 Mosaic to Davidic idea of the law. So one of the issues of the Hebrew roots is they don't understand covenants. They refuse to acknowledge the nature of the covenant that we're in, the new covenant. And so because of that, this is going to be a pitfall for them, because they then have to accept rabbinism when it comes to the law. As we've said many times, the New Testament does teach the law, but it teaches it applicable to the new covenant. It does not teach the law applicable to rabbinism. It does not teach the law applicable to even the Mosaic covenant. So there's kind of 3 different paths, and we have to go over those really quickly. The Sinai or Mosaic covenant of the law is instituted in such a way that you earn your salvation, and in this way you have an earthly salvation, salvation being life in the land of Canaan in Palestine. You can live in Palestine, and you can have a good life, and you'll be given prosperity by God if you keep all the precepts of this law. So that is what the law of Moses is about in the Sinai covenant. Okay, guys? We understand that so far? That is not the case before the Mosaic covenant or after the Mosaic covenant, or after even the Davidic, So from Moses until Christ, you have to do the law to earn your keep. That's how it works. Whereas before Moses, you do the law simply because it's good. It's a cosmic, natural creation. So like, for example, the Sabbath. That's a cosmic ordinance. Not killing people. That's just good for all of creation, but you're not going to be rewarded for not killing people. Whereas in the law of Moses, in the Sinai covenant, you are rewarded for doing the law. It may not be instantaneously, like I do a law, where's my gift? It doesn't happen instantly like that. But that way is the same way that the rabbinics operate under the law today. If you do the law, you can earn your way to glory and salvation. If you do not do the law, you will take away from your glory and your salvation. The new covenant does not work like that. So if the Hebrew roots do not understand proper covenants, how can they do the law? If they do not acknowledge that they're in the new covenant, and that this covenant, as the reformers say, is more similar to Abraham's covenant. He's quoting St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. And also there's reference to that in Galatians, and even mentions in Hebrews as well, the epistle to the Hebrews. If we are in fact in a covenant more similar to that of Abraham, but now with the knowledge of Moses, then we cannot be doing the law the way that the rabbinics do, the Pharisees of that day. So the Pharisees of that day, which are today's rabbinics, added precepts onto the law for two reasons. Number one, they thought they were saved by the work of the law alone, which St. Paul says, no, absolutely not. So St. Paul says the law is just and holy and is good. We don't say the law is garbage. We don't say the law is gone. But the law does not save you. The atonement that Christ gives us, his salvation, his defeat of death, is what saves you. So that is what St. Paul says. And that's why St. Paul goes against the Judeans, meaning the Pharisees, in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. So the Hebrew roots don't understand what covenant we're in, then they have to do rabbinic version of the law, which contradicts the New Testament, which means they don't in fact believe in the New Covenant. They don't in fact follow the New Testament. So then how are we following this law? So that's one of the main problems they have. Another one they have is this whole ethnic idea. The ethnic idea that they have is that they maintain that the Gentiles need to behave as if they were Judeans. And that's another problem because St. Paul says, come as you are, essentially. Like if you are born a Greek, stay Greek. If you're born Judean, stay Judean. If you're Jewish and you eat the matzah bread this way, eat it that way. If you're not Judean and you're a Greek and you like feta cheese and olives, you should eat feta cheese and olives. You should follow the God revealed to the Israelites. He's your God too. But you don't become an Israelite. You don't become a Judean. So that's another problem these Hebrew roots guys have. A lot of them, they do their quote sermons and stuff, and like here they dress as if they're rabbinics. Like this is a completely rabbinic idea. The black wiring and then having the word of God literally written on your forehead. That's something that number one is a rabbinic invention that has nothing to do with ethnic Israel at the time of the New Testament. Number two, though, it's being conflated with the race of the Jews simply because the race of the Jews today practice rabbinism. So it's kind of a negation. It's a bad thing either way. You're negating from your own ethnicity, which is why you cannot be part of this movement of idolizing the racial Jews. And remember, one of the main problems of the Judeans, which is mentioned throughout the New Testament, is that they're obsessed with their lineage. Abraham is our father, so we are righteous. And Christ says, if you really were Abraham's children, you would follow me. Okay, and there's many other mentions as well. One of the big conflicts between the early church and the rabbinic sect, so we're not talking about sects like the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, between the rabbinic sect and the New Testament church, is this idea that they're still obsessed with this racial supremacy. And so the racial idolatry of the rabbinics cannot be something that bleeds into the Gentiles. We can't have people pretending to be Judeans. We can't have guys flailing around with the Israeli flag saying this has anything to do with scripture. Another problem with the Hebrew roots, now that we've got the Israeli flag here with this guy Steve Gregg, Jewish roots, Hebrew roots, whatever you want to call it, is it almost undeniably ends up becoming a futurist eschatological movement, which is really just political Zionism. And the guest I had on here the other time, Mr. Israelite, ironically, he's named that, but he doesn't actually think he's a racial Jew. So he's not doing what these Hebrew roots guys are doing, per se. But with the Israeli flag, my guest last time made it very clear that Zionism is not just some racial Jewish invention of the rabbinics to trick the Goyim. There's a lot of Gentile Christians who have something to gain from this geopolitical entity of Zionism. And one of them, right here, what's this? Strand Baptist Church. Even though they're attacking the Hebrew roots movement, whenever the Israeli flag shows up, you're going to see a Baptist church or an evangelical church. So the Hebrew roots, in addition to not having an awareness of the covenant system, belong to futurist eschatology. So they think their salvation and they think the truth of scripture written 2,500 years ago, talking about the prophecies of Daniel, Gog and Magog, is somehow talking about nuclear post-Soviet Russia invading Ukraine. Okay, Gog and Magog is not Russia invading Ukraine. There are only two viable paths that make any historical sense. You have the path of historicism, where many of the events occurred in the first century, but many of them are still unfolding throughout history. So the New Testament is describing history, as is the Old Testament, describing all these different empires. Then you have partial preterism, which up until a certain point is kind of historicist, in that it agrees that there are certain empires throughout time that are talked about in the Old Testament, but then everything other than the second coming has already happened concerning the apocalypse of John. So partial preterism is held by the majority of the apostolic churches. Historicism is held by a minority in the Eastern Orthodox Church, Oriental Church and the Protestant churches as well. But those are really the only two that make any sense. Futurism is just an invention that was promulgated by a handful of Jesuits and then an enormous amount of evangelicals and Baptists to make it a geopolitical movement and tie Christianity into Pax Americana, essentially. Even though it was invented long before that time, it's most widely used for this reason. So we have number one, not understanding the law properly, doing it in a rabbinic way. Number two, because of the lack of the covenant. Number two, geopolitical eschatological futurism. Number three, LARPing as a rabbinic. And then number four, we're going to say inconsistency with the law. So what do I mean by say inconsistency of the law? I mean the fact that, all right, dude, we're not going to have spamming in here. We're going to go time out for a minute. What I mean by that fact is that there is not any consistency when it comes to the law. So see, a lot of these Hebrew roots guys will say, hey, I do the law, man. I don't eat pork. I'm circumcised. I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees, to quote St. Paul. I do all these ordinances, but they don't keep the moral commands of the Torah. And so when we look at the moral commands of the Torah, what are those? Stuff I can't really even mention on here. So that means purging the evil from your midst in concerning to people who do soothsaying, witchcraft, certain sexual preferences and things like that. There are harsh punishments toward those things, and that is supposed to be the revealed word of God on the law. So the law of Moses is in fact something that needs to be kept throughout time. Then, and again, we're keeping it in a way where, hey, we keep all of it except for the sacrifice system. Why aren't any of them that conservative? You'll notice a lot of them, they have an evangelical flair or a Baptist style sermon in a Baptist or evangelical looking building, talk about the pork and stuff and why all the Christians are wrong about the Sabbath and whatever. And I do think a lot of lay Christians do have a very weird misunderstanding of the Sabbath. But that aside, they don't do any of these moral things. They don't say we're going to go and purge the evil from our midst. I mean, if anything, the apostolic churches did that way better throughout most of history, to the extent where the Roman Catholic Church is characterized by the reformers as being a complete bloodthirsty, merciless church running around massacring people all the time who were seen as enemies of their establishment. And so the Orthodox Church, while nowhere near that level of kind of insanity that was happening in Western Europe, did in fact wage wars on people, did in fact defend their homelands, did in fact punish people for blasphemy and heresy. They exiled them, not without, of course, hearing them out, but they would exile these people, and in many cases, people would come to blows and go to war, such as during the schism between the Roman Church and the Nestorians, and then later the Roman Church and the Miaphysite Oriental Orthodox churches. So this idea that, hey, we're the real Old Testament Christians, there's no militarism in them at all, other than saying, hey, we vote for pro-Israel policies. But there is nothing about purging this evil that's within our land itself. It's all about fulfilling some obscure Gog and Magog Russian-Ukrainian prophecy or some Israeli prophecy that has nothing to do with anything that was written down 2,500 years ago. So that's another issue that they have. They're not consistent with the law. It's all about circumcising and eating pork and stuff and talking about the Sabbath and having a menorah, but then they don't put the law into the heart of the nation when it's time to put the law into the heart of the nation. So how on earth can there be this law movement when these guys refuse to put the actual sword of the law in practice? So that's quite an interesting thing. And then another thing that's interesting is that a lot of them have a misunderstanding of what some of the classical churches believe. So the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox churches do in fact keep portions of the law. Can't say that they keep the whole of the law, but they keep portions of the law. In the Eastern Orthodox Church and in the Oriental Orthodox Church, the Sabbath is kept. End of story. That's it. It's not partially kept. It is kept. Now, all the writers, including St. Ignatius, says we do not keep the Sabbath in the way that the Jewish or the rabbinics do. So we do not forbid people from lighting a fire on the Sabbath. But it is a day of rest. It's an important day. It's a holy day. It's a hallowed day. It's the Sabbath of the Old Testament. And then the Lord's Day, or the day of the resurrection, is kind of this new Sabbath of the New Testament. Not really a new Sabbath, but just a day that is observed. So nobody says that Sunday is the Sabbath. Even the Roman Catholic Church, who accuses the Greek Orthodox Church, Pope Urban IV or V, he says the Greeks taking the Sabbath as the rabbinics do, make themselves like the sect of the Nazarenes. So he says basically the Orthodox Church is Jewish because they keep the Sabbath. But even the Catholics will not say Sunday is the Sabbath. They acknowledge Saturdays the Sabbath. So all these big, Roman churches actually do have a concept of the Sabbath. Now, of course, the Latin Church goes on with the Gregorian calendar, the Roman solar midnight to midnight and dawn to dawn style of time, marking a new day, which the Orthodox Church disagrees with. In the Orthodox East, we say that a day begins at sunset. So sunset to sunset, the evening and the morning, that was one day according to God himself. So God does not change time. Daniel 7:25, the Antichrist religion will attempt to change God's times and God's Sabbaths. So yeah, you can't really there's really no way around that verse. The Orthodox Church does in fact keep the evening to evening time. The Orthodox Church does in fact keep the Sabbath. I don't care if some layperson says, well, I don't. Good for you. But the writings, and I've proven this in my video, does the Orthodox Church keep the Sabbath, all says that you do in fact keep the Sabbath. That's why you have these Vesperal liturgies on Saturday evening in the first place, and you have stuff leading up to that Friday as well. So what is the point of having that if there isn't any Sabbath? The Oriental Orthodox churches are the same, and it's not a cultural thing. And we're going to get into the Tewahedo churches in the next one. But the point is, the East does have semblance of the law. In the Russian Orthodox Church, the Syriac Oriental Church, the Coptic Oriental Orthodox Church, Tewahedo Church, Armenian Church, and the Syriac Malankara Church in southern India, as well as Syriac branches in Pakistan, they all say that there's hygiene rituals that we keep from the Old Testament, such as if a woman or even a man are unclean due to any kind of sexual activity, they are not to come into the liturgy. That's part and parcel, part of the continuity of the Old Testament liturgy. You guys may say, well, hang on a minute, Dream, now you're getting off on a tangent. But I want to show you guys something because I think this is very important. Okay? Something that you boys don't understand. Okay, if we look at this here, what do we have? What do we have? So if we look at this here, we see that this is the design of an Orthodox church, Eastern Orthodox church. Why is this important? Why do I bring this up? Because the Orthodox Church claims to be a continuation of the Old Testament. And when it says it's a continuation of the Old Testament, there's a marked difference between that and what the Roman Catholic Church, the Western churches say. So the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches will say, yes, we have a Jewish aspect that we get from the Old Testament. But they will say the Old Testament was one way of worship, and now we're in a different way of worship. The Orthodox Church, the only thing they'll say is that iconography can be used even more now because the Son was incarnate as matter. So there's nothing really wrong with matter itself. But we still don't make 3D images, or at least you're not supposed to within liturgy, and you don't carve your own 3D image at home. That would be kind of idolatrous because you're just kind of doing it yourself without any spiritual supervision and not according to any kind of liturgical guidelines. So it's actually physically impossible in the Oriental Orthodox Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church to alter the liturgy. But the point is that the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches say they're at the continuity of the time of Moses into now, whereas the Roman Catholic churches will say, well, that was just kind of generic Judaic monotheism. Now the New Testament, we have the Trinity and all this other stuff, so that's why it's different now. So there's a big difference there because the Orthodox Church says, no, we always had this Trinity stuff in the Old Testament. We always had the divine Son. We always had the tabernacle, and that's what the Orthodox Church is based off, this tabernacle. So that's what they're basing it off of. That is the whole point. So there's a major difference in how the East and the West look at how do we fulfill the book? How do we fulfill the Old Testament? And so with the Hebrew roots, they focus entirely on the Roman Catholics, and I guess they have a reason to. Where they focus on like some evangelicals, to which there's not much of a difference between themselves and an evangelical. But they don't understand that there's a difference when you take a look at the East. At least there's supposed to be. A lot of people don't follow that precisely, but there is supposed to be. So that's kind of an introduction into the Hebrew root stuff. Why I think it's wrong. There's some issues with it. Some of the stuff they do, which is incorrect, and why it's incorrect. Why it's incorrect, and why they don't follow the law the way they claim that they follow the law. So I think that that's kind of that. And I'm going to take a look at a couple comments here. There's a reason in Greek and Slavonic the term for a church that you worship is called a temple. Yeah, and another thing that's interesting in Church Slavonic is that the Trinity is never called the Triune God. It's actually called the Godhead, and so that's again more traditional Christianity, which lends itself to monarchia. So I get some of these Wagner fanboys come on here, and they say stuff like, "Well, your monarchy is Arianism," but that is exactly how the early church talked. They used monarchical language, and they distinguished themselves from Arians. I mean, they're the ones who had the debates with the Arians. It wasn't the Latins who did that until significantly later. Hebrew, to be more precise. Abraham wasn't a Jew. Yeah, Jewish, Judean, all comes from Judean, Yehudai. And so that really doesn't become an identity until the time of Solomon. So I go over that in my book, that this whole Adam Green conspiracy that these guys have come up with, that it's a, quote, Jewish trick from the dawn of history, doesn't make sense because there weren't Jews until the time of Solomon. A culture, a civilization, identity like Jewish identity is not just I'm a nomad from the desert who practices one God, because spoiler alert, there's hundreds of millions of Arabs who have that exact same identity and they don't call themselves Jews. The Jewish identity is its own identity that really is crafted during the time of Solomon. Before that, there's a Hebrew identity, but it's very generic. It's not a cultural identity. It's an identity of lineage. There isn't much of a culture for them to cling to other than I have one God and I live in the desert. So it's not until the time of Solomon. So that's what we understand there. Nat Trad says, I'm Sephardic. Congrats. What are you guys talking about? Here we go. Hello, Jeem. I'm a former Jew. Well, you're still technically Jew racially, but I'm a former rabbinic who was born Jewish and became an Orthodox Christian inquirer. What works can you direct me to directly disprove many of the Jewish Old Testament talking about? Well, that's the thing. Like here, you're coming up with a strange distinction, my friend Nat Trad, because there is no attacking the Old Testament. We don't attack the Old Testament. Like, you might see some Latins do that and some Protestants say, hey, that Old Testament Jewish stuff, that's against what our apostles said, but we don't talk like that in the East. And in the East, we do keep the Sabbath, so we have a fulfilled New Covenant Sabbath. We do keep the law as applicable to the New Covenant, at least major aspects of it, but not to the extent that the Hebrews would be pleased. And we do claim to be the East does claim to be the complete continuation of the Old Testament system. So my advice to you would be that you need to get this thing out of your head that the Old Testament equals Judaism and the New Testament is this Catholic Christian religion. It's supposed to be completely linear. So if you talk to your rabbi, I need more proof to present to my rabbi and my family. Yeah, if you want to talk to your rabbi and your family, you need to talk that the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. It's one book. It goes together. It's not a different book written by these different people that aren't at all associated but with the Old Testament's writers, or not associated with the Old Testament system. Because the East doesn't claim that. The East claims that we are, in fact, have the exact same theology. That divine representative angel in the Old Testament. Well, that's what we call the Son of God, and that's how he is fulfilled via the New Testament. So that's kind of the continuation there. But if you want some refutation of rabbinism itself, I've done many videos on the law, and so I've shown you guys that I did just answer your question there, so I think you posted that before I just started talking. But the point is that I have done many videos showing why there is a difference between the law that Christ and Paul and Peter and even Moses are talking about, and then the laws that the rabbinics have kind of added on to that. And, their justification has been, we need to teach people how to do the law. And so teaching them how to do the law, we have to invent these mini laws that go around it, kind of like yellow caution tape that goes around the actual crime scene. So we're not going to let you into the crime scene because you're going to get stopped by the tape first. And that's how we keep you safe. Again, because the law itself and its works are, in fact, the way to salvation in that version. In that version of understanding the law. So in their system, we don't have any way to be saved other than doing the law repetitively, and so they have a different view. Thank you very much for the super chat, P Divine. Great to see you here. Nat Trad, just check out my playlist. I've done a lot of stuff on rabbinics before. S sells only the Marcionite heretics abandon the Old Testament. Yeah, and apparently there have been a lot of that online. So when you talk to people in real life, yeah, okay, not every priest in every parish knows these like debunk arguments of rabbinics and stuff, but they don't need to. They're busy leading a flock. But the point is that the average people in real life are not lunatics. If you go on the internet, you're bound to find a lot of lunatics. I've seen so many people say, I don't need no Old Testament. The Old Testament's bad, or you're a Jew if you like the Old Testament, and then the vice versa with the Hebrew root stuff and the Ebionites. So you just kind of have to get away from that on the internet. Okay, ascetic mother, that's what I was trying to tell you. So please listen to this part very carefully. There are multiple covenants in the Old Testament itself. So Muslims make this mistake too. They think you have the Old Testament covenant and the New Testament covenant, and that's it. In the Old Testament, before Moses is born, before he even arrives onto the scene, there are already multiple covenants. You have the covenant of Eden, the covenant of Adam after the fall, Noah, Abraham, and all of these covenants, they did not do the law to be saved. So when St. Paul says Abraham was saved by, says James says Abraham was saved by his faith, and St. Paul mentions this as well. And he mentions different parts of the Old Testament. That's exactly what we're saying. The new covenant, the New Testament, is more similar to Abraham's day. That's what the salvation is like. Abraham's faith is what saved him. Faith in who? Faith in God. And so how do you have salvation in the new covenant? You have faith in God via the crucifixion, the death, the resurrection of his son, Christ, who destroys death, took on the sin of the world. So yes, the law is complementary to life on earth, but it's not what you do to be saved. In the new covenant, and anyone before Moses, the same was applied to them. They did not do the law to be saved. So remember, before the time of Moses, there is no Sinai covenant. All right. Are any of your books on this topic? Yes, my book does discuss this topic at length. Guys, you don't have to respond to Wesley Curry, who I've put in timeout like a million times. There. So that guy's gone. But that's kind of it. I'm not going to do too much longer. So if you guys want to ask any more questions, now would be the time. And please, as Emmanuel says here, buy my book, The Misunderstood Bible, version 2, second edition, on Amazon. Check it out. It will answer all these questions and then some. Is rabbinism futurist? In a way, yeah. The way that they view their eschatology is that there were some things that happened in the past, but also the prophecies are talking about the future. That's why a lot of Zionists have used that via 1948 and the Six-Day War to be a covenant of God's grace with them, that they were able to best the Muslim armies around them and return after 2,000 years of exile. They thought it had a very religious significance, where in reality, it's a secular endeavor. Arcadius, Jim, is there anything we can do to boycott as laymen against church? I heard a lot of scary Gnostic and lib Neoplatonism BS preached by clergy. Well, if you're hearing stuff that's wrong, my advice would be to try to report that. Also, be sure of what you're saying too. Like, well, give me an example. What is this Neoplatonist stuff? Because if there are people teaching that, unfortunately, you're going to find in real life a lot of people stray and they learn from modernist schools of thought and they apply that into a modernist lifestyle and they teach that to modernist laymen. And so that does happen sometimes. Happens an enormous amount. Basically, the entirety of Vatican II is modernist laymen and modernist clergy. What covenant were they following before John the Baptist? They, up until the time of Christ, they were loosely following the Sinai covenant. So even though there was the Davidic covenant, that exists at the same time as the Sinai practices. So they're waiting for David's lineage to come into fruition. That's going to be the Messiah. And at the same time, they're doing the law in order to be saved because they don't have any other way to be saved other than, asking God and repenting to God. That's kind of it. But as you see in the Old Testament over and over, God says, I told you, if you do my commandments, I will keep you safe. I will guard you from your enemies. He gives them time. Sometimes he gives them 50 years, 100 years of them doing apostasy. And then he'll finally come in and say, I was patient with you, but now you're whoring after idols, and you have been whoring after idols for 100 years. You've forgotten your ancestors. You forgot I took you out of Egypt. So now I'm going to let my champion here, Nebuchadnezzar, is going to come in and he's going to destroy you. So that's how the Old Testament works. I don't know much about the Bogomil's heresy that much, so that's all I would say about that. But the Orthodox Church basically just deals with the fact that the church is kind of the immune, infallible institution, but no man can be. So any man can do error. Any man can be outside the flock if he says things that are false. It's really you want the canon of the Eastern Orthodox Church. What's the truth? It's the 7 ecumenical councils. And so I would say definitely that the Eastern Orthodox Church is the church that follows the 7 ecumenical councils. Now, the Oriental Orthodox Church doesn't follow 7, they follow the first 3, right? So they don't care about following the 7 ecumenical councils, they care about following their 3 councils. They would argue, we are the church that follows the first 3, everybody else is an apostate. The Eastern Orthodox Church is really the only church that properly follows the 7 ecumenical councils in the way that they are described in those canons. You can read Philip Schaff, you can read any of the councils, and you can understand that. Ascetic Mother, the first edition is not even available to buy. So the second edition is just a better formatted version of the first one with a few extra chapters. So don't buy the one that says addendum. That's a small booklet that's supposed to go with the first book. So people who bought my first book, then maybe they don't want to buy the whole second one. They buy the mini booklet that goes with the first book. But if you haven't bought either of them, just buy the second edition. Were the radical Protestants who traveled to North America Judaized? No. The ones who came to New England were not, except for the Puritans. So the Puritans were part of the Judaized version of Christianity. Like Oliver Cromwell and people like that. They had a very Hebraic understanding of the Old Testament. They didn't do the whole law, but they were law-abiding in a way. They had their Sabbath. They had absolutely no imagery whatsoever, very iconoclast, so they interpreted themselves as being like that. We had an even stronger Hebraic element going on in the South and then down into the Southwest as well. Those settlers are very Hebraized. And that's the thing, like these Hebrew roots miss. They think everybody up until them was not doing a Hebraized faith, but a lot of Protestantism in America, particularly, so not European Reformed churches, the Reformers, I mean Lutheranism, the Reformed churches, etc. In America, in particular, the evangelicals and the Baptists themselves were already very Hebraic. So the Baptists even keep one of the Feast of the Trumpet, for instance. Like they keep some of these feasts that are biblical Old Testament feasts. And the evangelicals denounce everything that's Roman. So they just deny all of Roman Christianity. So the Hebrew roots are really just kind of a more extreme version of evangelicals and Baptists. They don't understand covenant theology. They don't understand the differences between what the Old Testament was and what we're in now. They're just kind of like saying, hey, we are Jews who accept the New Testament, basically. So that's a very different way of speaking. Black Snowflake, I don't know what your deal is, dude. I've talked about rabbinism a million times, and I actually, believe it or not, I actually debated the number 1 anti-Semite on the internet, Adam Green, and I bested him, and that has 20,000 views, and you can watch that on my channel. So if anybody's anti-Semitic, so someone who's against the anti-Semitic conspiracy of the rabbinics ruling the world, I've proven that stuff is stupid, and it's a waste of time for Christians to get involved in a conspiracy theory like that. Now, if you want to attack Zionism and Zionist lobbyism, go ahead. That stuff's real. But ruling the whole world stuff is not. And I am ethnically Semite, so I don't even know what you're talking about, dude. Like, I literally come from the exact region that the Yehudi cousins come from. Yeah. So, Ascetic Mother, the Seventh-day Adventists are also, good point, are also like the Hebrew roots. We're going to talk about some of their problems, actually. Great. I really wanted to bring that up because now we got one more topic to mention before I go. So with the SDA church, the problem that they have is that they kind of like what do I want to say? Okay, I don't know what you guys are talking about, J-Dye, just being distracting now. They're kind of like the Hebrew roots. So the Seventh-day Adventists, they're a restorationist group. They think everybody except them have done wrong, but they're not consistent because they accept, obviously, Trinitarianism. They accept many of the ideas that the Protestants brought into their churches. So they have Protestant baggage, but the Protestants themselves have Latin Catholic baggage. And so R.J. Rushdoony, he's not a Catholic or anything, but he's also not a Protestant. He says, "Hey, I'm not part of the Reformation." And he says, the reason the Protestants failed is because they took the piety of the Latin Catholic Church, amped it up to 11, and they didn't have any of the Roman trappings. So with the Roman Catholic Church, you have this piety, this piousness to them, the piety, uh, this humility, the kind of intensity of hatred against lust and other things like that, and this kind of what I want to say, almost like a dry piety is what the Protestants emulate. So they took all this kind of piety from the Latin Catholic Church. I know I'm saying that word a lot, and they infused it a very dry sense of shame. And so Rushdoony attacks them for that. And the Seventh day Adventist Church um, is also doing the same thing, but to another level. So they're taking from the people who took from the Catholics. The Reformers hate the Catholics, but they took their theology from them. And this SDA does not associate with other Protestants, but they took their theology from Protestantism. So all these groups who claim to be the one true religion that's finally cracked the code all happen to agree with everything St. Augustine says. Well, what a coincidence. Everybody was wrong about everything except for St. Augustine, except for the Trinity, and except for the soul and all these other metaphysical ideas. And so if you look at John Calvin's writing on Psychopannychia, a great example of this, he claims to dislike the Catholic Church. He claims to hate Roman paganism, but in Psychopannychia, he's speaking as if he is the grandson of Plotinus himself. So he doesn't even know how to escape from the Greco-Roman paganism that he claims to be attacking. He is guilty of it, as is Luther, okay? As are the rest of the Reformed, for the matter of fact. Okay, so the Reformed tradition, the Dutch, the Swiss, the Presbyterians, take all their baggage from the Catholics, and of course they purge it as best they can of Roman paganism. So they try to have a very clean understanding of what is biblical instituted religion, but they still fall prey to the fact that they are not incorruptible. And then groups like the SDA are the same. They're basically a detached non-denomination. Well, not they are a denomination, but they're kind of like a non-denominational church that just happens to observe the Sabbath. So they don't care about Sunday, the Lord's Day. They just do the Sabbath. So they're like Sabbatarian Protestants. My whole problem with them is they don't need to go this far, and the Hebrew roots don't need to go that far. If they just wanted the Sabbath, all they have to do is join the Eastern Orthodox or the Oriental Orthodox Church. If they just want to circumcise and not eat pork, they can join the Oriental Orthodox Church and do the Tewahedo stuff. If they don't want to go to the church because they're sexually unclean, you can do that in a Russian or Slavic church of any kind. So that's my problem with these groups. They only care about circumcision, pork, and the Sabbath, and you can do all of that in the Eastern churches. You don't have to invent this Protestantized church to get that done. So that's the problem. They're making up a church for making up a problem that doesn't need to exist, all because they're basing all their suppositions on Rome, number one. Number two, they're not even following the law properly because they're ignoring at least 200 laws that are found in the Torah, in the law. And all they care about is shellfish, polyester, Sabbath, and stuff like that. Like it's all just surface level stuff to make yourself look like you're this ancient Hebrew, when in reality, you're just a Protestant who does the Sabbath. So I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced, guys. All right. I'm going to read a couple more. How much is Qatar paying you? Not enough. Not enough. Like, Vigo. This is the guy who demolished Green in a debate about the Yahudim. Anti-Semitic is the last thing I would call him. Zionism is not biblical, and that was Green's whole argument that it was. Thank you. Let's go down. I don't know what you guys are talking about. Here we go. Super chat, $10. Thank you very much. I'm _no_expert. Appreciate your work, Gene. Bought your book. Keep it up. Awesome. Thanks, my man. I hope you enjoy the book. Let me know if you have questions regarding it. Okay, Black Snowflake, I did talk quite a lot about Christ. So you say we're talking about Jesus Christ. Yeah, I have talked a lot about him. But yeah, you guys need a little about me. Yeah, exactly. Dustin, great. This is exactly what I was mentioning. The SDA gets debunked by the existence of the Eastern jurisdictions. So the SDA, they presuppose papal supremacy. The Pope changed the day of worship, which is exactly what Daniel 7:25 says not to. So the SDA does have like this they are on the right track by saying, hey, Rome shouldn't change the days, but by them assuming that Rome was just like the ruler of the whole earth and just changed everybody's calendar when nobody's looking, they're ignoring an entire half of the church. Nofer Tadros, look at my other videos on that. And St. Augustine is not a total heretic. I didn't say that. He's just incorrect on a few things. He mixes way too much Neoplatonism with his idea of cosmology, and he has a strange Manichaean bend that even though he attacks Manichaeanism, he doesn't quite move away from that. And so his hatred of the self and kind of punishing himself inwardly, and that high emphasis on that and this guilt is really kind of the key to understanding Western spirituality and why it goes in a different bend than the East does. All right, thank you guys. I'm going to call it a day, and that's it for tonight. And for the guy who said how much is Qatar paying, again, I will say not enough. So they got to up the pay a little more. Next video,